So I want you to picture yourself sitting on that, that crinkly paper.
Oh, yeah, the paper covering the exam table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are in a modern doctor's office. You are wearing one of those terrible paper gowns, and you are probably freezing.
You are definitely freezing.
Right. And you are sitting there waiting for a diagnosis.
Yeah, and when the physician finally walks in, they look at your chart, they hand you a treatment plan.
And there is this profound, almost subconscious expectation of certainty in that moment.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
you trust the process because it just feels so objective.
It really does. It feels like clean, finished science.
Because we view the medical system as this polished, completed architecture.
Right.
It is incredibly comforting for anyone sitting on that exam table to believe the person in the white coat is, operating from a place of absolute, unassailable biological truth.
But the reality of how we arrived at that modern exam room is, well, it's a lot darker and, frankly, a lot more chaotic.
Oh, massively chaotic.
Yeah, if you strip away the polished veneer and look at the foundation of medical history, you don't find this, unbroken chain of rational discoveries.
Not at all.
You find a mountain of staggering, catastrophic errors. I mean, for the vast majority of human existence, medical care essentially consisted of confidently held, vigorously applied, and completely disastrous ideas.
Disastrous is almost an understatement. We are talking about interventions that actively killed people.
Right, and championed by the absolute brightest minds of their respective generations.
Yeah, it is the ultimate study in paradigm blind spots. These were not, fringe practitioners operating in back alleys somewhere.
Right, this was the establishment.
Exactly. This was the absolute peak of the medical establishment,
Yeah.
enforcing treatments that were entirely divorced from physical reality.
And investigating that disconnect is, it's crucial because evaluating the modern medical system, which, you interact with every time you fill a prescription, is impossible without understanding the error-producing mechanisms of our ancestors.
We absolutely have better diagnostic tools today, obviously. But the fundamental psychological and, sociological traps that caught ancient physicians are still heavily active in the halls of modern hospitals.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack the sociology of knowledge.
How do we actually know what we know?
Exactly. How does an entire profession drag itself from mysticism to rigorous empirical science? And most crucially, we want to give you, the listener, a framework for navigating your own healthcare.
Right, by understanding how this incredibly messy history still shapes the way your doctor thinks today.
So to do that, we really have to look at the sheer weight of the wrong history.
The historical record reads less like a scientific journal and honestly more like a horror story.
It really does. I mean, you have bloodletting, which wasn't just a medieval fad. It was the unquestioned standard of care for 2,000 years.
2 millennia of just bleeding people.
Yeah. And then you have the miasma theory of disease.
Right, the idea that foul smells and bad air cause sickness.
Exactly. And that drove global public health policy centuries after germ theory should have been obvious.
Then there is the era of 19th century heroic surgery, which is just, it's wild to think about. This took place before the advent of anesthesia and antisepsis.
Which means the patients were awake.
They were completely awake. Surgeons were revered entirely for their speed. A great surgeon could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes.
Wow.
But the patients who miraculously survived the sheer agony of the knife almost inevitably died days later.
From infection, right.
Exactly, from massive systemic infections. The surgery was considered a success, but the patient died.
And, lest we think this is all ancient history, the 20th century gave us the thalidomide disaster.
Right, where a supposedly safe sedative caused severe birth defects globally.
Yeah, and we had lobotomies handed out as casual cures for complex psychiatric conditions.
We had decades where board-certified physicians confidently assured patients that smoking cigarettes was perfectly harmless.
I think they even said it was beneficial for clearing the lungs at one point.
They absolutely did. So the historical reality shows this terrifying disconnect between biological theory and clinical practice.
Right. We operate on the assumption that understanding a disease and effectively treating it are intimately linked.
But the historical record suggests otherwise. Sometimes we stumbled into effective treatments entirely by accident, without any coherent theory.
At other times, we possess perfectly logical, theoretically coherent frameworks that they systematically killed people.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy because it's hard to visualize.
Yeah, let's do it.
Think of practicing historical medicine like trying to fix a failing airplane engine mid-flight. but the mechanic is wearing a thick blindfold.
Okay, that sounds terrifying.
Right, you reach out, you turn a wrench, and maybe a rattling noise stops. You feel the sense of accomplishment.
But you have absolutely no idea why the rattling stopped.
Exactly. You don't know the mechanism.
Mhm.
For all you know, you just loosen the bolts holding the wing on. The noise is gone, but the plane is about to crash.
So the blindfold analogy really captures the danger of action without mechanism.
Yes, if you don't understand the underlying causal relationship between the wrench and the engine, or the drug and the body, any perceived success is merely an illusion.
An illusion that reinforces bad practice.
Precisely.
So, if these early physicians were flying blind, how did they initially construct their medical worldview? I mean, when a human being is sick and suffering in front of you, the pressure to do something is overwhelming,
It is, and that desperation takes us back to the dawn of recorded medicine.
where the boundary between physical biology and spiritual mysticism just, well, it simply didn't exist.
Right. The ancient world did not compartmentalize the universe the way we do. Our modern minds insist on a sharp division between natural phenomena and the supernatural.
We want a clear line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to a physician operating in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, or Greece, attempting to treat the physical body while ignoring the spiritual realm would have been considered, hopelessly ignorant.
You can see this incredibly vividly in the Ebers Papyrus.
Oh, that is such a fascinating document.
It really is. This is an ancient Egyptian text dating back to roughly 1550 BCE. It's one of the oldest preserved medical documents in human history.
And reading it is a completely surreal experience.
Yeah, because you find these incredibly precise, sophisticated descriptions of anatomical structures.
You have detailed clinical presentations of specific ailments side by side with plant-based remedies, and this is crazy modern pharmacology, concerned actually possess active therapeutic compounds.
So they weren't totally clueless. They were highly capable empirical observers.
They were. They recognized cause and effect regarding certain biological interventions.
Hmm.
But those physical interventions were heavily entwined with spiritual ones.
Right, like right next to a surprisingly accurate anatomical diagram of the heart, the prescribed treatment protocol for an ailment involves chanting a highly specific magical incantation.
An incantation intended to drive a demon out of the patient's body.
They were attacking the illness on a physical dimension and a spiritual dimension simultaneously.
Because to their minds, this dual approach was entirely internally coherent. Imagine a patient presents with a severely rotting tooth.
Okay.
The physical reality, the decay, is undeniable. But the ancient physician asks a secondary causal question. Why is this specific tooth rotting in this specific person at this specific time?
Right, they want the root cause, no pun intended.
Exactly. And the answer, logically, must be a curse or a malicious spirit that targeted them.
So pulling the tooth or packing it with herbs only treats the symptom.
Exactly. If you failed to perform the incantation to break the curse, the underlying cause remains unaddressed.
Treating just the physical symptom would literally be considered malpractice in that paradigm.
It makes perfect sense if you accept the premise.
But that entirely blended paradigm suffers this massive intellectual earthquake in 5th century BCE Greece.
Spearheaded by Hippocrates and the physicians at the School of Kos.
Right. This is the historical moment where someone finally draws a hard line in the sand and says, diseases have strictly natural causes that we can investigate empirically.
The shift initiated by the Hippocratic corpus just cannot be overstated. It was a violent severing of medicine from theology.
And the most famous example of this is their redefinition of epilepsy, right?
Yes. Prior to Hippocrates, epilepsy was universally categorized as the sacred disease. A seizure was interpreted as literal divine possession.
Like a god had violently taken control of the patient's body.
Exactly. The Hippocratic physicians explicitly rejected this, stating that epilepsy was a physical disease of the brain with natural physiological causes.
Just like a cough or a fever.
Right. It's a massive triumph for science. They introduced the absolute necessity of clinical observation, actually writing down a patient's symptoms day by day.
They studied environmental factors, dietary influences. They developed the concept of prognosis.
And they gave us the ethical framework of the Hippocratic Oath. They are positioned as the undisputed heroes of medical history.
But there's a devastating irony hidden in this achievement.
Oh, the legacy of Hippocrates is deeply, deeply complicated.
Because, wait, so the same guy who heroically separated medicine from magic actually locked us into a scientific theory that was arguably just as dangerous to patients.
Yep. The exact same movement that gave us clinical observation locked humanity into humoral theory.
For anyone unfamiliar, this is the doctrine of the four humors, right? Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
Yes. The theory posited that every human disease was simply a mechanical imbalance of these four fluids.
And this is the so-called rational framework that justified slicing open veins and bleeding patients to the point of unconsciousness for 2 millennia.
It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about the evolution of knowledge. The rational framework of humoral medicine was not necessarily less physically harmful to patients than the supernatural incantations of the Ebers Papyrus.
In many cases, it was significantly more lethal.
Much more lethal.
Hmm.
But because it was rational, because it sounded like science, it was exponentially harder to eradicate.
I struggle to understand how intelligent observers couldn't see the failure of their own
It
actions.
was hard for us to grasp today.
If you slice a patient's arm, drain a pint of their blood, and they become visibly weaker, paler, and then die, how does a supposedly empirical observer not immediately conclude that the theory is flawed?
Because humoral theory was an incredibly elegant, internally consistent, closed logical loop.
What do you mean by closed loop?
It provided a framework for processing failure that protected the theory itself. Let's say a patient presents with a violent fever.
Okay.
The logic dictated they were suffering from an overabundance of the hot, wet humor, which was blood. To restore internal balance, you must physically remove the excess heat. You bleed them.
And if they die?
The theory easily absorbs the failure. The physician simply concludes that the disease was too advanced when the patient arrived.
Or they blame the patient.
Right, the patient's constitution was too weak.
Yeah.
Or, most tragically, they conclude that they simply didn't remove enough blood soon enough.
Wow. So the fundamental premise of the treatment is never questioned, only the timing or the dosage?
Exactly. The theory is functionally untouchable because any outcome, survival or death, can be perfectly explained away using the internal rules of the theory itself.
A perfectly logical system that completely lacks objective, empirical testing is not a science. It is an intellectual prison.
Humoral theory was systematic, it made intuitive sense, and it had the backing of massive intellectual authority.
And its absolute confidence in its own internal logic, completely untempered by adequate statistical testing, was its fatal flaw.
It's terrifying to realize that a theory can survive for 2,000 years, actively making patients worse, simply because it feels logically sound.
So how did a system that was so visibly flawed in practice maintain a stranglehold on the human intellect for so long?
This points to a bizarre psychological quirk of our ancestors. For centuries, the medical establishment trusted ancient books significantly more than they trusted their own physical eyesight.
The veneration of ancient authority was absolute. I mean, from the days of the Roman Empire right through to the European Renaissance, medical education was completely dominated by the writings of one individual.
Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician. His extensive writings on anatomy and physiology became the unquestionable gospel of medical science.
The problem was that human dissection was largely taboo in ancient Rome.
So Galen constructed his incredibly comprehensive anatomical models by dissecting animals.
Mostly pigs and Barbary macaques, right?
Yes, he simply assumed the internal structure of a human was identical to an ape.
And he was, consequently, wildly incorrect about significant portions of human anatomy.
But his authority was so deeply entrenched that it created a mind-bending form of cognitive dissonance.
Oh, this part is just wild to me.
If a Renaissance doctor in the 1400s actually participated in the dissection of a human corpse,
Right.
and they physically looked into the chest cavity and saw that a blood vessel was not where Galen's text claimed it should be,
Right.
their first thought was not Galen made a mistake,
Where first thought was, my eyesight must be failing.
or the executioner must have damaged the vessel.
Yeah.
There was even a prevailing belief that human anatomy itself must have degraded and deformed since the perfect era of Galen.
That is the ultimate manifestation of cognitive conservatism.
The professional establishment blamed the observer, or they blamed the physical corpse on the table, but they absolutely refused to blame the text.
The written word was considered absolute truth. Physical reality was just a flawed, dirty reflection of that text.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think of it like trying to navigate a modern, rapidly expanding city using a map drawn 1,500 years ago.
Okay.
You are driving down the street, meticulously following the ancient parchment, and suddenly you drive straight off a dock and your car plunges into a river.
Right.
As the water fills the cabin, instead of admitting the map is outdated, You yell at the windshield for tricking you, or you curse the river for having the audacity to move into the road.
You would literally rather drown than question the authority of the map you were holding.
That intense psychological refusal to update the map dictated medical education until the anatomical revolution of the 16th century.
Which was sparked by a man named Andreas Vesalius. In 1543, he published a massive revolutionary text titled De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body.
And Vesalius utilized a radical paradigm-shifting methodology to understand human anatomy.
He actually looked at it.
He looked at it. He performed systematic, meticulous human dissections with his own hands.
Because the standard practice at the time was for a medical professor to sit high up in a chair reading Galen out loud,
While a lowly assistant or barber surgeon hacked away at a corpse below, completely disconnected from the academic observation.
Vesalius got his hands dirty, he mapped the human interior, he commissioned these extraordinarily accurate illustrations, and systematically documented hundreds of specific errors in Galen's ancient texts.
Vesalius fundamentally redefined the epistemology of anatomy. He shifted it from being a literary discipline where knowledge is gained by interpreting an ancient scroll
To being a strictly empirical domain where knowledge is gained by direct physical investigation.
Naturally, one would assume the medical establishment rejoiced, updated their syllabi, and celebrated his empirical rigor.
Yeah, you'd think they'd be thrilled. But the exact opposite occurred.
Vesalius faced fierce, coordinated resistance from the medical elite of Europe.
Because if you accept Vesalius's drawings, you destroy the careers of an entire generation of professors.
Their prestige, their income, their societal standing, it was all built entirely on their mastery of Galen's texts.
The resistance to Vesalius really highlights a repeating pattern in the sociology of knowledge. Established theories persist in the face of direct, undeniable physical evidence because of professional investment.
The cognitive dissonance is too agonizing. If a senior physician admits Galen is wrong about the structure of the jawbone, they might have to entertain the thought that Galen is also wrong about bloodletting.
And if the entire foundation is rotten, they are no longer an esteemed healer. They are a fraud who has been harming people.
But once you introduce the concept of empirical observation, you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Physical reality eventually wins out.
That brings us to William Harvey in 1628, who delivers the fatal blow to Galenic physiology by completely overturning how humanity understood blood.
For a millennium and a half, the medical consensus was that blood was continuously manufactured in the liver from the food you ate.
Right, and it was then slowly pushed out to the extremities where it was completely consumed by the tissues, like wood burning in a fireplace.
The Galenic model was a one-way street. Constant production in the liver, constant consumption in the flesh.
Harvey dismantled this entirely, proposing a closed circulatory system driven by the mechanical pumping of the heart.
But the way he proved it is the fascinating part. He didn't just look at it, he used mathematical quantification.
Yes, Harvey calculated the internal volume of the human heart. He measured how much blood was expelled with a single contraction.
He then multiplied that volume by the average heart rate of a human over the course of a single hour.
The resulting mathematical calculation proved that the heart pumped a volume of blood in 1 hour that massively exceeded the total weight of the human body. The liver could not possibly synthesize that volume of fluid from a person's diet. It was a physical and mathematical impossibility. The blood had to be moving in a circle.
He combined that irrefutable math with physical ligature experiments on animals and humans. Let's walk through how he actually did this, because the mechanism is brilliant.
It really is.
If you tie a tight string, a ligature, around a person's upper arm, it cuts off the blood flow. Harvey observed that the veins in the forearm below the string would rapidly bulge and swell.
While the veins above the string remained flat.
Exactly. And furthermore, he mapped the small one-way valves inside those veins.
He demonstrated that if you press your finger on a bulging vein and try to push the blood backward, away from the heart, the valve catches it.
The blood can only flow in one single direction.
The mechanical evidence of the valves, combined with the fluid dynamics of the ligature, prove that veins return blood to the heart while arteries pump it out.
It is a stunning display of scientific logic. So, by the 17th century, humanity finally has an accurate map of the body's internal structure and an understanding of the circulatory plumbing.
But having a perfect map of the organs didn't stop patients from dying by the millions.
Right. Because the greatest threat to human life wasn't structural ignorance. The real enemy was entirely invisible to the naked eye.
This forces the medical community into a massive crisis, leading to the deadliest, most consequential discovery in medical history germ theory.
Before the mid-19th century, if you asked the world's most brilliant physician why an entire urban neighborhood was suddenly dying of cholera or the plague, they would point up at the sky.
This was the era of miasma theory.
The deeply held conviction that diseases were caused by bad air arising from rotting organic matter, urban filth, or swamp water.
Miasma theory is a fascinating paradox in the history of science. Theoretically, regarding the biological mechanism of disease, it was completely undeniably wrong.
But pragmatically, it was highly correlated with physical observations that were entirely accurate.
Think about it. If you walk into a desperately impoverished, unsanitary 19th century slum, the air smells absolutely horrific.
There is open sewage, garbage, overcrowding.
And the people living in that slum are dying of infectious diseases at catastrophic rates.
So concluding that the foul-smelling air is the direct causal agent of the disease feels incredibly logical to an observer at the time.
The irony is that the fear of this non-existent bad air motivated genuinely massive, highly effective public health interventions.
It drove the construction of extensive underground sewage systems in major cities, the implementation of clean municipal water supplies, and the redesign of urban architecture to ensure better ventilation.
They drained the swamps and cleaned the streets to banish the smell.
And when they built the sewers to get rid of the smell, cholera rates plummeted. They did exactly the right things for entirely the wrong reasons.
It's the blindfolded mechanic again. They stopped the rattling engine, but they thought it was because they appeased the wind gods by clearing the air.
Not because they physically removed waterborne bacteria from the drinking supply.
Exactly. Because the public health interventions successfully reduced disease, the medical establishment felt entirely justified in maintaining their incorrect theoretical basis.
But while miasma theory was cleaning up the city streets, the sterile-looking hospitals were still functioning as absolute death traps.
Which brings us to the tragic, infuriating story of Ignaz Semmelweis.
In the 1840s, Semmelweis was an obstetrician working at the Vienna General Hospital.
And he was confronted daily with a horrifying reality. Healthy women coming into his specific clinic to give birth were dying of puerperal fever.
What was colloquially called childbed fever at staggering catastrophic rates. We know now that this was essentially massive bacterial sepsis, a systemic infection.
The mortality rate was so notorious that pregnant women in Vienna would literally beg on their knees in the streets not to be admitted to Semmelweis's ward.
That is just heartbreaking. So Semmelweis does something incredibly rare for his time. He obsessively analyzes the hospital's internal data.
And he notices a glaring discrepancy. There are two maternity clinics in the hospital.
Right. The first clinic is staffed entirely by male doctors and medical students.
The second clinic, located right down the hall, is staffed entirely by female midwives.
The mortality rate in the doctor's clinic is astronomically higher than the midwives' clinic.
He searches for a variable that differentiates the two wards. The breakthrough comes when a colleague of his accidentally cuts himself with a scalpel during an autopsy.
And he dies a few days later, displaying the exact same physical pathology as the women dying of puerperal fever.
Semmelweis realizes the terrifying pipeline operating inside his own hospital.
The male doctors and medical students begin their mornings in the morgue, performing anatomical autopsies on diseased corpses.
They finish, wipe their bare hands on a rag, and then walk directly down the hall to the maternity ward to perform vaginal examinations and deliver babies.
The midwives, conversely, have no business in the autopsy room. They only deliver babies.
Semmelweis lacks the vocabulary of microbiology. He does not know what a bacterium is, but he correctly identifies the mechanism of transmission.
He deduces that the doctors are carrying what he termed cadaverous particles on their hands from the rotting corpses directly into the open wounds of childbirth.
To stop it, he implements a rigid protocol. He forces every doctor to scrub their hands in a harsh, chlorinated lime solution before examining any pregnant woman.
And the results are instantaneous and undeniable. The mortality rate in the doctor's clinic plummets to match the low rates of the midwife's clinic.
He has the statistical data in black and white. He solved the puzzle. He stopped the dying.
And for his brilliant life-saving deduction, the medical establishment ruins his life.
They absolutely destroy him.
I think this is where modern patients need to pay very close attention. If Semmelweis had the statistical proof that washing hands saved mothers, how could doctors be so arrogant as to ignore it?
What's fascinating here is that it wasn't just arrogance. It was a paradigm clash. You must place yourself in the sociological mindset of a 19th century gentleman physician.
Okay, so these were elite men.
Very elite. They belonged to an elite social class. They viewed themselves as saviors. The prevailing belief was that a gentleman's hands were inherently clean.
The very idea that a doctor could be dirty was socially offensive to them.
More profoundly, accepting Semmelweis's data meant accepting a devastating moral burden. If Semmelweis was mathematically correct, it meant these esteemed, wealthy surgeons and obstetricians had to admit that for their entire careers, they had been the direct vectors of death.
They had been inadvertently murdering the very mothers they were sworn to protect.
The psychological defense mechanisms employed against that realization were insurmountable. So to protect their own egos, they dismissed his statistics as flawed.
They ridiculed his rigorous hand-washing as excessive and insulting.
They systematically marginalized him until his contract was not renewed.
Semmelweis, entirely consumed by the rejection and the continued preventable deaths of women, suffers a severe nervous breakdown.
He is committed to a mental institution. And in a bitter historical irony, he is beaten by guards and dies shortly afterward from a septic infection and a wound.
The exact pathology he dedicated his life to preventing.
He was a prophet without a paradigm. He proved that the intervention worked. But because he couldn't point to a germ under a microscope and explain why it worked, the establishment could easily dismiss him.
Medicine desperately needed a new foundational theory to explain the invisible world.
That paradigm shift arrived shortly after, driven largely by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, birthing the formal germ theory of disease.
Pasteur is the one who shatters the ancient idea of spontaneous generation. People used to believe that maggots just magically appeared out of rotting meat or that milk spoiled because of internal decay.
Pasteur proved that fermentation and putrefaction are caused by living, airborne microorganisms. He literally proves that the invisible world is swarming with life.
And he goes on to develop vaccines for rabies and anthrax.
While Pasteur provided the conceptual leap, it was Robert Koch who provided the rigorous methodological framework required to prove causality.
Koch isolated the specific bacterial agents responsible for tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. But more importantly, he established a strict set of criteria known as Koch's postulates.
Let's walk through exactly how Koch's postulates work, because this is the bedrock of modern infectious disease protocol. How do you prove that a specific invisible bug causes a specific disease?
Let's use anthrax as an example. First, Koch stated that the microorganism must be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but it should not be found in healthy organisms.
Right. If a sheep dies of anthrax, the bacteria must be present in its blood.
Second, the microorganism must be isolated from the diseased animal and grown in a pure culture in a laboratory setting.
So you pull it out of the dead sheep and grow it in a petri dish, proving it can exist independently.
Precisely. Third, the cultured microorganism must cause the exact same disease when introduced into a healthy, susceptible organism.
You inject the lab-grown culture into a healthy mouse, and the mouse must develop anthrax.
Finally, the microorganism must be re-isolated from the newly inoculated diseased experimental host and identified as being identical to the original specific causative agent.
It is a closed, perfectly verifiable loop of logic. You find it, you isolate it, you infect with it, and you find it again.
It removed disease from the realm of bad smells and curses and placed it firmly into reproducible science.
And it was Joseph Lister, a British surgeon in the 1860s who read Pasteur's work and realized its terrifying implications for the operating room.
If the air and surfaces were covered in invisible, lethal microbes, then cutting a patient open was inviting death.
Lister introduced antiseptic surgery. He mandated that surgeons wash their hands, he sterilized surgical instruments with carbolic acid, and he even sprayed a carbolic acid mist into the air during operations.
He transformed the surgical theater from a slaughterhouse into a genuine environment of healing.
Now, Lister also faced heavy resistance initially because surgeons deeply resented being told their operating rooms were filthy.
But unlike Semmelweis, Lister had Pasteur's robust, proven germ theory backing him up. The physical evidence became too overwhelming for professional arrogance to ignore.
But the stories of Semmelweis and Lister reveal a glaring, fundamental problem that still plagued medicine: human bias.
Even with germ theory, doctors were still relying heavily on observational data.
They lacked a systemic way to objectively evaluate whether their treatments worked because they were emotionally, professionally, and financially invested in the outcomes.
Medicine needed an ultimate truth serum to strip away human bias entirely.
This brings us to what is arguably the single most important methodological innovation in the entire history of medicine.
The randomized control trial, or the RCT. This concept is the invisible shield protecting you every single time you pick up a prescription bottle from your pharmacy.
To appreciate the power of the RCT, we have to understand the fatal flaw of observational medicine. Historically, a doctor bleeds a patient with a fever. The patient eventually recovers.
The doctor writes in a medical journal, "I bled the patient, the fever broke, therefore bloodletting cures fevers."
The doctor assumes a causal link, but the physician has absolutely no objective way of knowing whether the patient recovered because of the bloodletting or despite the bloodletting.
Exactly. Perhaps the patient's immune system successfully fought off the infection on its own, and they survived the illness despite the doctor draining a pint of their blood.
Without a controlled comparison, observational data is constantly polluted by what we call confounding variables and profound confirmation bias.
Let's use a modern hypothetical. You feel a cold coming on, so you take a massive dose of vitamin C. 3 days later, you feel perfectly fine.
You tell everyone, vitamin C cured my cold.
But the confounding variable is that most mild colds resolve naturally in 3 days anyway. You don't know if the pill worked or if time worked.
Enter the randomized controlled trial. The underlying logic is beautifully simple, yet philosophically profound. You take a large group of patients suffering from the exact same illness.
You randomly assign half of them to receive the experimental treatment. The other half, the control group, receives a placebo or the current standard of care.
The randomization is the magic trick. By assigning people randomly, you ensure that the two groups are statistically identical regarding age, genetics, underlying health conditions, and disease severity.
The only variable that is different between the two groups is the drug itself.
Therefore, if the treatment group recovers at a significantly higher rate than the control group, you can strip away all the confounding variables and confidently assert that the treatment directly caused the improvement.
The breakthrough moment for this methodology was the 1948 trial of streptomycin for treating tuberculosis, designed by Austin Bradford Hill.
This is widely cited as the first truly rigorous RCT. It utilized random assignment, but it also utilized blinded outcome assessments.
Blinding is crucial. In the streptomycin trial, the physicians evaluating the patient's chest x-rays to see if they were improving were not told which patients received the experimental drug and which received bed rest.
Because they didn't know who was supposed to get better, they couldn't unconsciously inject their own biases into the evaluation.
That trial became the gold standard template for all modern clinical research. It initiated a monumental shift in healthcare.
Medicine was no longer based on the sheer authority or intuition of the physician. It was based on the authority of statistical data.
This movement eventually formalized in the 1990s into what we call evidence-based medicine, or EBM, spearheaded by Gordon Guyatt and researchers at McMaster University.
Evidence-based medicine established a very strict hierarchy of evidence to guide clinical decisions. At the absolute top of the pyramid, you have large-scale randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses.
Let's define meta-analysis quickly. That's when researchers gather the data from dozens of different RCTs on the same drug, combine all those thousands of patients into one massive statistical pool, and analyze it.
To get an incredibly clear, highly accurate picture of whether the drug actually works across diverse populations.
Precisely, and at the very bottom of the EBM hierarchy, expert clinical opinion.
The historical standard, "I have been a doctor for 30 years, therefore my intuition is correct," was demoted to the weakest form of medical evidence.
It represents a massive transfer of power away from the individual doctor's ego and toward the aggregate spreadsheet, and EBM has saved countless lives by aggressively weeding out ineffective or actively harmful treatments.
But it has also generated intense pushback from clinicians.
The pushback is rooted in the reality of clinical practice. Critics argue that evidence-based medicine overvalues the pristine, highly controlled environment of the clinical trial at the expense of the messy reality of the exam room.
An RCT might definitively prove that a new blood pressure medication works perfectly on a carefully selected group of 40-year-old participants with no other health complications.
But when a doctor is sitting across from an 82-year-old patient who has diabetes, early-stage kidney failure, and a history of heart disease, that trial data doesn't perfectly map onto them.
The trial participants don't look anything like the human beings sitting in the clinic. Critics argue EBM sometimes forces doctors to treat a statistical average rather than the complex individual right in front of them.
It is the permanent tension in modern medicine, navigating between population-level statistical data and individualized clinical wisdom.
But randomized controlled trials rely on an underlying premise that contains its own bizarre mystery. To prove a new drug is effective, it has to beat the control group.
It has to show statistically better results than the people taking a literal inert sugar pill.
But here is where the mechanics of human biology get deeply weird. What happens when the control group, the people swallowing a capsule containing absolutely nothing of pharmacological value, starts physically getting better?
We have arrived at the most misunderstood mechanism in all of healthcare, the placebo effect.
The term placebo is almost entirely utilized as a dismissive pejorative in everyday language. We say, oh, it's just a placebo, implying it is entirely psychological, a delusion, or just bad data where patients lie to their doctors about feeling better to be polite.
That is exactly how I always viewed it, a fake effect.
The biological reality is entirely different. Rigorous, modern studies have proven definitively that placebos produce objective, highly measurable physiological changes within the human body.
We are not talking about subjective mood improvements here.
No, we are measuring physical drops in blood pressure, measurable alterations in immune system markers, and quantifiable changes in symptom severity using validated clinical scales.
Wait, so you are saying that if my brain believes I have taken a powerful medication, my physical anatomy will literally attempt to medicate itself?
Yes, and the research conducted by Ted Kapchuk at Harvard Medical School has pushed this phenomenon into territory that challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness and healing.
Kapchuk pioneered the study of what are called open-label placebos.
I read about Kapchuk's study while preparing for this, and honestly, the mechanics of it seem biologically impossible. If you want to trick the brain, deception has to be central to the process, right? In a normal trial, the patient doesn't know the pill is fake. Their belief triggers the response.
Kapchuk removed the deception entirely. He ran trials for conditions like irritable bowel syndrome and chronic back pain. He handed the patients a bottle of pills and explicitly stated, "These are placebo pills. They contain absolutely no active medication. They are inert."
But he added a crucial piece of context. Clinical studies show that the placebo effect is powerful, and taking these pills can trigger your body's self-healing processes even when you know they are fake.
I cannot wrap my head around that. If I know the pill is just rice flour, there is no belief. How can there be a physical response to a known lie?
Astoundingly, the patients taking the open-label placebos showed massive, statistically significant improvements in their physical symptoms compared to control groups who received no treatment at all. The conscious knowledge that the pill was fake did not stop the body from initiating a healing response.
What is the physical mechanism causing that? How does a fake pill alter cellular biology?
The placebo effect isn't a single mechanism. It is a complex family of neurological responses. One primary mechanism involves the endogenous opioid system. The human brain possesses its own internal pharmacy, capable of producing powerful painkillers, like endorphins.
When a patient takes a placebo for severe pain, the expectation of relief triggers the brain to physically release these endogenous opioids.
How can we prove the brain is releasing actual opioids and not just imagining the relief?
Through chemical blocking, researchers took patients experiencing placebo pain relief and injected them with naloxone. That's a drug specifically designed to block opioid receptors in the brain. It's what paramedics use to reverse heroin overdoses.
The moment the naloxone blocked the receptors, the patient's placebo pain relief instantly vanished. The pain returned immediately. This proves the placebo was utilizing the exact same physical neurological pathways as a drug like morphine.
That is breathtaking. The brain is manufacturing its own morphine based on an expectation. Are there other mechanisms?
Another major pathway involves the dopaminergic reward circuits. This is highly visible in conditions like Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by a severe depletion of dopamine in the brain, causing tremors and stiffness.
When a Parkinson's patient receives a treatment they believe will help, even if it's a placebo, the anticipation of the reward triggers a massive surge of dopamine release in the brain.
That physical dopamine surge directly alleviates their motor symptoms.
So, if a sugar pill can trigger a dopamine release or an opioid dump, that fundamentally redefines the role of a physician. It means that when I go to the doctor, the physical environment, the crisp white coat, the stethoscope, the empathetic tone of voice, the physical touch during an exam, isn't just polite customer service.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ritual of care itself is an active biological intervention. The therapeutic relationship, the empathy of the clinician, and the meaning we attach to the medical environment directly alter human physiology.
So, synthesizing everything we've explored, our mastery of clinical trials, our deep understanding of cellular biology, and our evolving recognition of the profound mind-body connection, we arrived at the landscape of modern medicine. It is the pinnacle of human achievement.
But to navigate it effectively as a patient, we have to honestly assess where we stand today. What are the absolute triumphs, and where are the hard ceilings?
The capabilities of modern medicine would appear as literal sorcery to a physician living just a century ago. The triumphs are staggering.
We routinely place patients into deep, controlled unconsciousness, stop their hearts, repair microscopic vessels, and wake them up days later. We have turned certain cancers from universal death sentences into manageable inconveniences.
The development of statins and advanced surgical interventions has caused mortality rates from cardiovascular disease to plummet. We take organs out of deceased individuals, implant them into dying patients, and they walk out of the hospital.
The massive century-long gains in global human life expectancy are the direct result of these acute interventions and public health infrastructure. It is a monumental achievement of empirical science.
But the limitations of our current paradigm are becoming agonizingly apparent, particularly as demographic shifts create an aging population. Our medical system is spectacularly proficient at acute care, but it is deeply struggling with the burden of chronic disease.
The analogy that makes the most sense to me is a house fire. Modern medicine has perfected the art of putting out blazing fires.
If you contract a life-threatening infectious disease or you are in a massive car crash and need acute trauma surgery, modern medicine brings the fire trucks, kicks down the door, and saves the house.
The problem is, we're trying to use fire hoses to treat a cracking foundation.
That perfectly illustrates the pharmacological disconnect. Diseases like type 2 diabetes, obesity, advanced neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, and the vast majority of autoimmune disorders are foundational cracks.
They are systemic, slowly compounding metabolic failures. We do not cure them, we merely manage their gradual decline. We can prescribe insulin to manage the blood sugar, but we cannot fundamentally reverse the underlying pathology of the metabolic dysfunction.
The frustration for patients is palpable. Millions of people suffer from chronic pain or treatment-resistant depression, and the medical system often cycles them through dozens of medications with only modest response rates. Why is it so incredibly difficult to translate our vast biological knowledge into a pill that actually cures a chronic illness?
The primary friction lies in the agonizing gap between basic science and clinical application. The failure rate of experimental drug candidates transitioning from the laboratory to human clinical trials is astronomically high.
I've heard researchers joke that we have cured cancer in mice 1,000 times over.
It's barely a joke. It's the reality of the animal model bottleneck. A pharmaceutical company can engineer a molecule that completely eradicates an Alzheimer's plaque in a petri dish, or reverses diabetes in a genetically modified mouse.
But when they administer that exact same theoretically perfect molecule to human beings in a phase 3 trial, it often fails completely. Or it produces lethal side effects that the mice never displayed.
A human being is infinitely more complex than a large mouse. The translation is slow, obscenely expensive, and highly uncertain.
And even when we do possess a miracle drug, the delivery system is fractured. The COVID-19 pandemic vividly exposed the vulnerabilities in our clinical trial infrastructure, which struggled to rapidly evaluate off-label treatments amidst the chaos.
Furthermore, possessing medical knowledge is functionally irrelevant if a patient cannot access it. We must critically evaluate global healthcare disparities.
The scientific miracles we just celebrated are drastically, tragically unequal in their distribution.
A treatment that exists in a textbook but is priced out of reach for a patient or is unavailable in their geographic region might as well not exist. The science is entirely dependent on the equity of the delivery system.
Which brings us to the most practical takeaway for you, the listener. You are the one sitting on the exam table. You are the one scrolling through alarming health headlines on your phone.
You are the one forced to make complex choices for your own body.
To survive and advocate for yourself within this incredible but deeply flawed modern system, you need a master key. That key is understanding medical language.
The vocabulary of healthcare is arguably the most practically critical specialized language a human being can master. Medical crises do not announce themselves in advance.
When they occur, you are suddenly thrust into a high-stakes environment saturated with the densest, most complex technical terminology in the English language, and you are expected to make life-altering decisions.
It is exactly like being dropped into a foreign country where you don't speak the language, but the stakes are life and death. Medical English is heavily stratified into two separate registers.
At the top, you have the highly precise technical vocabulary, the Latin and Greek-derived terms. This register is absolutely essential for global scientific communication.
If a physician in Tokyo notes a myocardial infarction on a chart, a cardiologist in London knows with absolute precision that it means a specific type of heart attack.
But that highly technical register must constantly interact with the patient-facing vocabulary, the plain language clinicians attempt to use when explaining a diagnosis to you. The translation gap between those two registers is incredibly perilous.
The ability of a physician to accurately translate complex pathology into accessible, actionable terms is a vital clinical skill. When that translation fails, the consequences are disastrous.
Patients misunderstand the prognosis. They fail to adhere to complex medication protocols because they don't understand the mechanism, and they are incapable of providing genuine, informed consent.
But mastering this language isn't just about understanding your doctor during an appointment. It's about surviving the modern media ecosystem. You need what we can call a defensive research vocabulary.
If you are reading about health, you must conceptually understand terms like double-blind, meta-analysis, and statistical significance. But the most vital concept you must understand to protect your sanity is the difference between relative risk and absolute risk.
The media's failure to distinguish between these two concepts is the source of endless public panic and scientific illiteracy. Journalists frequently misinterpret primary research data to generate terrifying, click-driven headlines.
Let's use a tangible example to walk through the math. You wake up, open a news app, and see a massive headline. New study proves drinking coffee doubles your risk of rare brain disease.
Naturally, you panic. You throw your espresso machine in the trash.
But let's look at the language. The phrase doubles your risk is referencing relative risk. It sounds terrifying, but if you dig into the actual study and look at the absolute risk, the actual real-world probability of the event occurring, the picture changes completely.
The study might reveal that the baseline absolute risk of a person who never drinks coffee contracting this rare disease is 1 in a million. The researchers found that for people who drink coffee, the risk increased to 2 in a million.
Yes, technically, mathematically, the risk doubled. The relative risk increased by 100%. But your absolute practical risk only shifted by one single microscopic fraction.
It went from 1 in a million to 2 in a million. Your chance of not getting the disease is still 99.99998%.
Understanding the mathematical difference between absolute and relative risk is the difference between living in a state of constant manufactured health anxiety and calmly drinking your morning coffee.
Possessing this vocabulary is an act of intellectual self-defense. It empowers you to demand clarity from your clinicians. If a doctor recommends a procedure and cites a 50% risk reduction, you must ask, is that relative or absolute?
You must not be intimidated by the white coat or the jargon. The overarching lesson of medical history is that absolute authority must continually be questioned by empirical data.
And that brings our journey full circle. We have traveled from the dual physical and spiritual interventions of the Ebers Papyrus through the 1,500-year intellectual stagnation caused by Galen's unquestioned texts.
We have witnessed the tragedy of Semmelweis, destroyed by the arrogant paradigm of his peers, and the triumph of Lister's antiseptics. We've explored the randomized controlled trial as our imperfect but utterly essential truth-seeking missile.
And we discovered the mind-bending reality that the ritual of care itself alters our biology through the placebo effect.
It is a history characterized by stumbling blindly in the dark, clutching desperately at logical theories, and slowly, painfully constructing an empirical method to separate what we deeply wish were true from what we can physically verify.
We owe an immense debt to the generations of researchers who relentlessly pursued that messy truth.
We absolutely do. The modern exam room is built on their triumphs and their devastating errors. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a concept to genuinely mull over the next time you interact with the healthcare system.
Given everything we have unpacked today, given the historical absolute certainty that every single generation of physicians believed they had finally cracked the code of human biology, only to be proven fundamentally wrong by the subsequent generation, we must ask ourselves a humbling question.
What universally accepted standard medical practice of the year 2026 will our descendants a century from now look back on as our version of bloodletting? What common intervention are we performing right now that will make the doctors of the future shake their heads in absolute disbelief?
It is a profound thought to carry with you.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the sociology of medical knowledge. Keep questioning the map, demand empirical evidence, and we will see you on the next deep dive.